Hey gang, have you ever noticed that most of us tend to view the past through rose-colored glasses? Whether it's that old boyfriend or girlfriend, memories of our high school or college glory days, or how the community we live in once was, we do this. We tend to think that nothing will match the past. And if you've been around the church for a while, you know we do this with the church. If you grew up around a church, many of us are inclined to think that the glory days for the church, well, they're behind us. Well, we got to be honest about something. There's something that's actually dangerous about our rose-colored memories. You see, our obsession with the past, it too often leaves us blind to all God is doing right here in the present. It leaves us with an unhealthy dissatisfaction, believing the glass is perpetually half empty, leaving us unable to see the beauty of the present. Worse yet, and this is why we're talking about it, this idolizing of the past is one more warning sign that we're becoming one of those accidental Pharisees. As your pastor, I have to admit something to you. The church has always been messed up. Always. You can find historians who will go on and on about how messed up the church was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago. You pick the era. There were even churches called out in biblical times for being more than a little dysfunctional. If you're Lutheran, 500 years ago, the church appeared to be on life support. The Bible, it had been buried under so many layers of tradition and ritual that no one even knew what the Bible said. The church was so obsessed with money that, get this, some of its leaders were offering forgiveness and a free pass into heaven in exchange for a healthy offering. They called them indulgences. People, these were definitely not the good old days. 50 years ago, scholars bemoaned the cultural irrelevance of the church. Time magazine posed the question on its cover, is God dead? Were those the good old days? You see, what's ironic is that despite all of its warts and failings, the church has always found a way forward. 500 years ago, it was Martin Luther and the Reformation. It confronted the corruption in the church, which led to the creation of a brand new sort of brand of Christianity that flourished, the Protestant church. 50 years ago, when all thought God was dead, there was a Christian revival in the U.S. And here's what I'm pretty certain of. I'm pretty sure God's got a plan for today as well. But here's what the truth is. We have a tendency to sort of catastrophize the future. And when we do, we become one of those accidental Pharisees we've been talking about. We start to believe that the sky is falling and we label this generation a polluted and filthy mess. Friends, this is what accidental Pharisees do. We get passionate about our faith, and then we start to think that the sins and failings of today are unique and rare, and we lash out in anger and judgment as if the sins of today were worse than the sins of our yesterday. Come on. I mean, think about our Christian history. There are plenty of sins and failings to go around. During World War II, good Christian people supported Hitler. Nazi flags hung in Christian churches throughout Germany. The atrocities of the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades were all done under the name of Christianity. Martin Luther's writings are at times so anti-Semitical, it's embarrassing. Yet most Protestants wouldn't hesitate to trace our roots back to the 95 theses he nailed to the Wittenberg door. The truth is, the good old days, they weren't always so good. But we do this. Every generation has this way of seeing only the worst in the next generation. For example, consider the generation of people we call the so-called greatest generation. Before they became the greatest generation, do you know what their parents and elders called them? When they were young, they were called the lost generation. Baby boomers in the 60s were labeled by their parents as anti-authoritarians, hippies, and anarchists. Gen Xers were pegged by their elders as slackers who would never get a job. You see, this is what accidental Pharisees do. They become obsessed with the sins and the failings of others. Now, in the book of Acts, this is what happened in the first church. The first church seemed to have a problem with a group of people called Gentiles. You see, the Gentiles, they weren't welcome in that first church. They weren't kosher. Good Christian people believed everyone who didn't share their Jewish heritage, they were filthy, polluted, and corrupt. The truth is, and there's no way to sugarcoat this, the early church was racist. We get a taste of this in Acts chapter 10 and 11, where we hear how the Apostle Paul was even unwilling to share the gospel with the Gentiles himself. But God sent him a special vision, and eventually Peter calls this big meeting, and before everyone in the church, he shares his experience, yet many in the church, they continued to insist that Gentiles couldn't be saved unless they adopted the Jewish laws and customs. Now here's what's ironic. My bet is that all of you who are listening to this are Gentiles. Think about it. The religious tradition that many of us, all of us, are a part of, the Christian church, at one time wouldn't have welcomed even you and me. Was the early church a shameful failure? No way. Should we cancel it? No way. But here's the truth. The story of the first church was a story of grace and mercy. It was a church filled with forgiven sinners who struggled with the same kinds of things we still struggle with today. The church was filled with well-meaning, God-fearing people who unintentionally, by idolizing the past, became accidental Pharisees. And yet God found a way forward. And honestly, that gives me hope. Hope not only for today's church, but for the future of the church. The church we're leaving our kids and our grandkids. Friends, as we close today, I'd like you to think of a couple of questions. The first question is this. Do you ever find yourself guilty of idolizing the past? To say it another way, what good old days do you find yourself longing for, and why? The second question goes like this. If you can be honest, what are some ways that looking at the past through rose-colored glasses might warp your perspective and what God wants to do through people like you and me? And finally, how might your idolizing of the past hinder your life of faith right here in the present? Folks, thanks so much for tuning in. I can't wait to wrap this up in session number 5.